Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. I'm Timothy Potts, the director of the Getty Museum, and very pleased to see so many of you here tonight and many more on Zoom for this, I'm sure, very interesting event. And in particular, because we have as our very distinguished colleague and friend and interlocutor for today's discussion, the director of the British Museum in London, and of course one of the great encyclopedic collections of the world. We're delighted also to have the Consul General, Paul Rennie, here from the UK. Thank you for being with us. And I'm looking forward greatly, and I hope you are also, to what we want to be a free-flowing discussion, conversation. Dr. Nicholas Cullinan has, since June of 2024, been the director of the British Museum, as I said, one of the great encyclopedic museums. Before that, he was director of the National Portrait Gallery in London, and before that, a curator at the Metropolitan in New York and at Tate Modern in London. And in 2024, he was also awarded an OBE for his services to the arts. We'll be talking tonight about some of the projects on which the Getty and the British Museum have collaborated, something about plans for the future, and more generally about the major issues and challenges that art museums face in today's world. We want to leave plenty of time for questions, both in the room and on Zoom. And so I will, at this point, dive straight in and ask Mr. Dr. Cullinan to join me on the podium, and we will begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for those joining online. Should we just dive in?
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah. We thought this was a good place to start because this is actually how Tim and I really began working together. And I think it creates some interesting points for discussion as we talk tonight. So this is Joshua Reynolds' portrait of Mai. And you see here on the left-hand side, this is it when it was installed at the National Portrait Gallery following the reopening of a major transformation project we did there during my tenure, which was completed in 2023. And this has quite a long and complicated story, this portrait. It's quite interesting. Yeah. Shall I begin? Because we both have sort of half of this puzzle. So this portrait is... in terms of British art history, is quite exceptional. So obviously it's by Reynolds, Joshua Reynolds, one of the great British portraitists, but it's of the figure of Mai, who spent time in Georgian England. This is, I'm trying to remember now, this feels like so long ago to me. This is around 1776. That's it, 1776. So Mai came to London and spent about a year or so there. Mm-hmm. And became really a sensation in Georgian England. And this portrait is, quite exceptional in Reynolds' oeuvre. It was in a private collection for him its entire life. It then changed hands about sort of 20 years ago, and that's when Tate Museum in London tried to acquire it, and that fell through. So in about 2021, obviously during the pandemic, and while we were closed to do this big transformation and we were sort of gearing up, I heard that this portrait was coming back on the market. And the way it works in the UK is that if something is deemed to be preeminent, such as this, there will often be an export stop that means that it just can't be bought and then shipped abroad. There has to be some kind of efforts to try to acquire it for the nation. And so I heard this was happening. And normally, the National Portrait Gallery, which is a wonderful museum, but a much smaller museum, we didn't have deep pockets or infinite means, wouldn't really be able to get anywhere near this type of a painting because the value is quite high. It was £50 million. So for us, that would have been, the largest acquisition we'd ever made was about £10 million for a Van Dyck self-portrait. And so I began, this is in 2021, during the pandemic, I began making phone calls, talking to my colleagues at Tate to see if they were interested, talking to my colleagues at the National Gallery to see if they were interested, because normally they would have had sort of the first shot at this. And at that time, because of the pandemic, and this was during a kind of cost of living crisis, everyone said, oh, well, we don't think this is the right time, it's going to be very difficult to raise the money. And then I spoke to John Studinsky, who's a trustee of the Getty, and he said, well, actually, this is a portrait that we're incredibly keen to acquire. I have to be careful because I'm trying to remember what's confidential and what's not confidential. I don't want to get into too much trouble. And basically, that began a really interesting conversation, really between Tim and I, but between the Getty and the National Portrait Gallery, that we both had an interest in this portrait. The Getty certainly had the means to acquire it. The National Portrait Gallery didn't have the means to acquire it, but had, essentially, because of the kind of export stop system, potentially first refusal. And where that left us is, rather than this kind of binary approach to cultural property, and especially in terms of where cultural property can be in the world, because often in the UK there's a phrase, when things are about to leave the country, there's a phrase that's used that I always find slightly irksome, which is it must be saved for the nation, as if it leaves the UK it's going to be sort of burned or something. Mm-hmm. And I found that a little narrow-minded in a way, and I thought there was something really interesting about, obviously, it's wonderful that it might enter a public museum, which is my real focus. It wasn't, should it be in London or LA? I wanted it in a museum, because it's such an incredible portrait. And this, I think for it to be in London, right by Reynolds Studio, where it was painted, obviously as one of the greatest portraits in British history, but then crucially also to spend half its time in Los Angeles, which has the biggest oceanic community outside the area, actually to me felt kind of very poetic and interesting. So there's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to hand over to you to give your piece of the puzzle, and then...
Sure. Well, in a sense, I think the basic structure of the deal was, 50-50, that we would each pay half of the cost of the work, and the work, the fair price for it had been established by the Arts Council of the UK. So it wasn't an auction situation where we were having to bid or bid against each other, fortunately. And so we agreed on that share, and it meant that we would share, therefore, also periods of possession. So the first 3 years, it's spending in the UK on not just at the National Portrait Gallery, but other sites that Nick can talk about. And for the shortly, though, that we're coming towards the end of that first 3-year period, and it'll come to us for 3 years here. And after that, we'll go into a new regime of 5 years and 5 years, and beyond that, I think it'll be another conversation, another discussion. But the idea is that we own it jointly, and we share it with equal periods of time. It is a large painting, and that brings certain challenges. So we have to be aware of the issues with transporting a work as large as this, and inherently fragile. It's not as old as a Renaissance painting, but still, it is one that needs careful care and attention to be shipped across the oceans as it is being done. So we're looking forward to having him here, I have to say.
Good.
And he will be the centerpiece of a display here, and also the centerpiece of a broader exhibition on celebrity in the 18th century in portraiture in particular. So it's been, I think, it's not exactly a new model because there's other institutions and we have other works we own jointly with, in fact...
Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, just not to dwell on it, but the Getty, share the ownership of the paintings you see on the screen. The two on the left we share with the Norton Simon Museum, the Poussin and the Degas, and the Mapplethorpe, the whole body of Mapplethorpe's work we share with LACMA. So the idea of sharing works between museums is not novel to us. We've all done it, but with a work as substantial and fragile and so on as my, it is it's as it were taking it to a new level, I think, of seriousness. And but it is something I think we at the Getty, and I presume likewise, we are very much open to and thinking that it's been a rare and occasional decision in the past. I can see it being more common in the future.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is, in terms of the UK, this idea was maybe less common of sharing something internationally. There are a few works that are shared or co-owned by UK institutions, and obviously we share and circulate. But I had quite a battle behind closed doors for a year or so to kind of make this happen, and there was huge pressure to really try and acquire it outright for the UK, and for it not to spend its time between two countries. And I have to say, I always loved the idea of having these two different contexts, which I think is much more interesting. So I was incredibly glad. Of course, that I only had to raise 25 million as opposed to 50, yeah. But much more importantly, that it really could be seen in different contexts. And I suppose what's interesting about beginning with this is, I think that I didn't know it, but this was finished in the summer of 2023. And then a few months later, I began the conversation about the British Museum. And I think the model that we developed with Getty of international partnership and cooperation, I think probably was quite helpful in me being appointed to the British Museum, because obviously this is a museum, as we will get into, that probably would benefit from more international collaboration and cooperation. And so that's kind of a theme of the talk tonight. Shall I move on to this?
Do.
Yeah. So this is a low-profile loan that you may or may not have heard about. But this really happened last year, but of course it comes to us in July and then opens in September. The biotapestry, which I'm going to assume I don't need to introduce too much. Of course, it's an extraordinary artifact. It was made in the UK after the Norman Conquest of 1066. We think in Canterbury by nuns, so we believe it should be called the Canterbury embroidery, not the biotapestry, but that's another discussion. And then, of course, it's been in France, in Bayeux, in Normandy, pretty much since it was made. And so this is the first time in almost a millennium it will come back to the UK, which is kind of extraordinary. The conversation around this potentially being loaned to the UK began back in 2018, when President Macron was visiting or talking to our then Prime Minister, and if anyone can update me on who the British Prime Minister is, that would be really helpful. I'm losing track, so if there's any updates during the talk, just shout out who my new Prime Minister is. But it was basically Macron offering this to Theresa May after Brexit to try to maybe bring two countries together that had suffered a bit of a sort of fracture. And then for different reasons, including the pandemic, it didn't happen. And then last May, I think it was, everyone was getting ready for Macron's state visit to the UK. And I heard from sources, in terms of the Department of Culture and some others, if this were to become possible, would you be interested? And I think you could probably guess my response. And we put it together incredibly quickly. I mean, by the Macron state visit was in early July, and he came with our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, to the museum to announce it. As you can see, essentially this is quite unusual because it's really a state-to-state loan. This transcends, one museum lending to another, although of course in this case, the Biotapestry Museum, which is currently closed for a major refurbishment, which is why this is being lent to us, is lending to the British Museum. But this involved, both the UK Prime Minister, the French President, and it involved the King, who was very supportive and behind this. And it's really kind of a remarkable thing to pull off. And I think what this shows is something that we're really keen to try to do at the British Museum, which is to see how culture can bring people closer together and countries closer together at a time when more and more we're all being divided from each other, whether it's because of politics or social media. And I think, this is maybe now one of the strongest arguments for an encyclopedic museum, which is very contested. Let's not ignore the elephant in the room, but that there is this chance to actually bring culture and therefore people of the world together under one roof and to have a conversation. So this is something that we're very excited about. So it opens in September. Please book your plane tickets to London to come and see it. You see on the right-hand image, this is just a little publicity stunt we pulled off when we announced ticket sales a month or two ago. We took over Piccadilly Circus in London. So huge interest in this. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is just as important actually, is this extraordinary loan that we've done to the Manaya Palace in Kumasi in Ghana. And this is of the Asante gold. And the British Museum has around 200 pieces of Asante gold, which was looted by British forces during the Anglo-Asante Wars of the late 19th century. And we're not the only museum. The V&A also hold some of the Asante gold along with others. And what we've been able to do in the last 2 years, this began in 2024, this just preceded me, is to agree along with the V&A a loan of the Asante gold back to Manaya Palace in Kumasi, which is fantastic. So things that have not been seen in Kumasi, and of course this is a very complex situation, are now back there, which is extraordinary. We were really delighted to welcome the Asantehene to the museum, to the British Museum, and he gave a lecture in the summer of 2024. And this is beginning a really fantastic partnership that we want to extend and develop. And this is, this is clearly a very emotive issue for people in Ghana, which refers to a real trauma. But we're trying to now work closer together to create a positive impact for both people that visit Manaya Palace, people that visit the British Museum. The effect this has had in Kumasi is extraordinary. Like school visits have gone up, I can't remember the statistic, but exponentially. And then you see on the right-hand side, this is a display we have currently at the British Museum, which looks at the so-called Asante ewer, which is the object in the middle. And it is a pewter medieval ewer, which is basically a big jug, that was made in Britain. It's a bit like the Bow Tapestry, made in Britain, but then somehow ended up in the Royal Palace in Kumasi. We don't know how, it's a mystery. And what you see above the jug is this photograph that was taken in the late 19th century of the two ewers that you see in the vitrine in the courtyard of the Royal Palace in Kumasi before, again, they were looted. And so this is a project that's currently in London. We're talking to Kumasi about whether we could also lend these and do a partnership. But as you can see, it's the beginning of trying to create a collaborative relationship over very understandably contested objects to create a more positive outcome. And this is something we're really focused on in the years ahead. This is maybe a more conventional endeavor, which is an exhibition that we have on currently at the museum, which is Hawaii, a Kingdom Crossing Oceans. And this runs until the end of the month. It's a really fantastic exhibition. And it was done, obviously, with our curatorial staff, Elise Christophe, who has worked at the museum in Hawaii and is very embedded within the community there. But also, crucially, it was we had a curatorial advisory group from Hawaii that were really part of the exhibition's making, from its gestation, its research, its interpretation. It involves, different perspectives brought to bear at the museum in London. And I have to say, the result, the effect is really remarkable, not just for the reviews the exhibition had, but when we opened the exhibition back in January, there was a large community and contingent from Hawaii. And suffice to say, at the British Museum, you get a little bit used to controversy and that people have different points of view about what you're doing. This was such a positive event, and you could see that real community engagement, not just paying lip service, but genuinely involving a group, had made such a difference. And I think this is really a model for us moving forward. I'll carry on. This is also very interesting. So obviously, we're the British Museum, so I should probably say a little bit about the British Museum for people that aren't super familiar. When we were founded in 1753, we were the first public national museum in the world. And Hans Sloane, who was really the the driving force behind the museum, an extraordinary and complex character, assembled this remarkable collection and gave it essentially to the nation, but with stipulations. And one was that it was to be, quote, for the benefit of all persons. So he wanted everyone to benefit from this collection. He wanted it to be free for everyone. And he also, although it's called the British Museum, and we were the first institution in the world to be called British, it was never imagined as something that should be parochial or even nationalistic. It was always about the world and for the world. And to that point, Hans Sloane very cleverly left a list of countries in his will that it was to be offered to, and that was based on international audience. So London was number one. This is the mid-18th century, so you can debate if that's changed. And then in descending order, and I might get this wrong, number two was definitely St. Petersburg in Russia, and then I think it was Paris, Berlin, and Madrid. But his vision was that this collection should reach as many people as possible. So that's a bit of a preamble to say that we obviously have been talking mostly about international, which is of great interest, but we also have a big responsibility as a national museum, and specifically not just to serve a London audience, although we welcome around 6.5 million visitors every year, which puts us as one of the most visited museums in the world, but we also share our collection as widely as we can. So although 6.5 million people saw the collection in London, around 8 million people see the collection outside London, elsewhere around the UK. So more people see the collection not in London than come to London. So to that end, we have something called partnership galleries, and we now have 7 across the country. And these are developed in dialogue with another institution, in this case, the Museum of Manchester. And it's rather than us sort of creating a British museum in Manchester, we have a discussion with another museum. We listen to what they want, what they need, what their audience wants, and then we endeavor to help them achieve that. And in a way, we're sort of a fairly silent collaborator in this process. And then this, which is the South Asian Gallery in Manchester, goes a stage further. This opened about 3 years ago. And again, this was done in real dialogue with the South Asian diaspora community in Manchester. And so this is a really important model for us, not just working internationally with countries like Hawaii or with Ghana, but also thinking, nationally, that the responsibility that we have, again, to really try to serve different audiences and to bring people together, but by doing that by listening rather than just sort of going into broadcast mode. Now, moving back to the international, this is one of the many projects we've done with Getty, and we're incredibly grateful for their support. And this is a fantastic initiative in Mumbai, which is the CSMVS Museum. And for now 15 years, we've been working very closely with them and with Getty's involvement and support in lending objects to a wonderful museum in Mumbai that has certain things in depth, and we lend things that they don't have, so it becomes a more encyclopedic endeavor. And so the latest iteration of this opened in December. I was there for the opening. And Getty has lent and supported. The British Museum has lent, I think, about 80 objects. Other museums, such as Berlin, have lent too. And it's a really, really fantastic endeavor. The other thing I should say is that you see the image on the right-hand side is a sort of new twist that we've put on this relationship. Because although for 15 years, we've been lending to Mumbai, it hasn't really been a reciprocal relationship, as in they've never done anything with us in London. So last year, for the first time, this is a little display we did, where basically the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai curated this display in London. So rather than us being in broadcast mode, it becomes a truly reciprocal relationship and partnership. And they have a presence in London. We have, you could say, a presence in Mumbai. And then the final example I wanted to talk about is, again, another wonderful collaboration with Getty, which has been ongoing for several years. And actually, I'm going to hand over to Tim in a second, because he should talk more about this, because he's actually been. I haven't got there yet. And it's a little bit difficult to travel to Iraq right now, but I'm looking forward to going. But this is a project that, again, has been underway for several years, which is an archaeological excavation in Girsu in Iraq, which was an extraordinary Sumerian city. And this has had several wonderful outputs, including publications, but crucially, and you can see here that it's done in collaboration with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities, it's been training an entirely new generation of Iraqi archaeologists. And we do a similar project in Benin City. There's a new museum that's just opened there called MOA, which opened in November. And we've had a project with young Nigerian archaeologists there for several years to work in collaboration with them and to train them. And this, in a way, is a sort of analog for that. And one thing that is quite important to say is a lot of the work that we do, and this, I think, will resonate with what Tim will talk about, it isn't just about objects. It's about knowledge. It's about scholarship. It's about research. It's about expertise. And a lot of the international relationships we have, some of them are very much focused on objects, especially things that were looted or contested. But there's a huge interest too in actually working collaboratively to exchange knowledge and information. But you should probably talk a little bit about this because, again, as I say, you've been
happy to. And it's in the context that the British Museum over the years, certainly in the 20th century, sponsored a number of archaeological excavations in the Near East, or what we now would consider the Middle East, and other parts of the Mediterranean world. And so the collection, and of course the great 19th century excavations in the Assyrian capitals and so on. So there's a long and deep history of the British Museum involved in everything from the actual discovery of the objects in the ground to their then excavation, often then being taken back to the British Museum itself, and a lot of research and, in fact, the whole rediscovery of Assyria as a culture and a civilization happened in the reading room of the British Museum, where all the tablets, the cuneiform tablets, were preserved and are still being worked on by scholars today. So I played just a small role in this. I was able to get to Girsu. We supported in a small way some of the work, the archaeological work, and that led to the publication a few years ago, and it is a landmark, but all credit to the director of that project, Sebastian Ray. And it's been a landmark publication on one of the most important Sumerian cities, from which we learn a lot about the earliest civilization as we know it in the world. So as I say, a small part we played, but we're very happy to be involved.
I've just got one final example to talk about, and then I'm going to hand over to Tim. This is the international training program that is just about to celebrate its 20th anniversary this summer. And I think this is one of the best things the British Museum does, and no one really knows about it. And every year, over the last 20 years, we have welcomed 20 museum professionals from all around the world. And over 20 years, pretty much museum professionals from all the major countries you can think of have been part of this. They come to the British Museum for 6 weeks. They spend another 2 weeks at a museum outside London, elsewhere in the UK. And it's created this incredible alumni network. Everywhere I travel, I was in Colombo in Sri Lanka in December. I was in Beijing in October. I'm not, sorry, just telling you where I've been. But the point is, everywhere I go, I meet people that were part of this, sometimes now other museum directors. And it's a program unlike anything else in the world. It is really extraordinary. And I think as a model of international cooperation, this is really exemplary. And this is something we're very much focused on. Obviously, carrying on the good work this does, but thinking of this as a model for the future, because the cumulative impact year on year of this is actually huge, and it's a really extraordinary thing. I'm going to hand over to you, I think, at this point.
All right. Thank you. Yes, that's me. And that's the Getty Center, which you all know and well and love, I'm sure, but not today's topic. So this is... the first thing I want to say is that I almost certainly would not be sitting here as director of the Getty Museum if it weren't for the British Museum. And why, how and why, what do I mean by that? Well, I have to, in fact, I'm taking you on a little detour, but I hope it will be of some interest. So in 1983, I was a research lecturer in Near Eastern archaeology at Oxford and co-director of an excavation in Pella in Jordan. And such was my luck that in that year I came upon a box decorated with the ivory's decorations. The box itself, and yes, that's me scratching in the dirt on the left, many years ago, of course. These ivories, the box itself had completely perished, but the ivories were preserved in their disposition in the soil so that you could work out what was the shape and style of the box. And in fact, it was in the shape of the shrine you see on the right, which comes from Tutankhamun's tomb, which has a winged disc across the front, the slope at the front of it, which is what you see on the slope of the lion box in the middle. So why am I telling you this story? Well, because immediately we discovered this, that presented a major problem. What were we to do? Because it was an incredibly important discovery, but clearly it needed restoration work where the box could be reconstructed and the ivories could be reset and re-inlaid into the way it would have been in its original glory. So I discussed it with the Jordanian authorities, discussed it with the British Museum, since I did have many contacts with curators and conservators there, and asked if I could bring it to Britain, into London, to the British Museum for the restoration to take place. And fortunately they agreed, and there on the right you see the curator, the conservator of the time, having constructed the form of the box and in the process of putting the ebony wooden frame around it and the ivories which decorated it into place. So this was, as it were, a moment in my career which was engaged with me very actively and intensely with the British Museum, and so was, a critical, as it were, point of contact for me with a major institution, which I, of course, visited regularly, knew many of the people, but had not, in a way, been formally involved in any way. But that was to come later. A few years later, again, still based in Oxford, I was approached by the directors of the National Gallery in Australia and David Wilson, who was the director then of the British Museum in London. And this David Wilson was the sixth directors prior to Nicholas, so some time ago.
It's like prime ministers, we cycle through them fairly quickly.
So I was offered the opportunity to put together an exhibition, really choosing around 100 masterpieces, telling the broad story of civilization in the Near East and the Mediterranean, from the early Mesopotamia and Egypt in around 3000 BC up to the Christianization of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. Of course, an offer I couldn't refuse, and was a very enjoyable 2 or 3 year project. And you see on the screen the catalogue of the exhibition that resulted from it, and that was shown in Japan and at 2 venues in Australia in the late 1980s. I tell you this because it was the experience of doing this exhibition and seeing how in a museum you are able to bring the, if you like, academic specialist expertise of, in my case, antiquities, in other case, people's case, whatever the specialty would be, but for me it was the ancient world, to bring that academic discipline to create experiences for the general public that could be genuinely meaningful, inspiring, and things that they carry with them through their life, in fact. The direct encounter with extraordinary works of art, and the British Museum is, of course, full of extraordinary works of art. This was very gratifying to see the impact that this could have on people who have not had the opportunity, particularly to travel to these parts of the world, to immerse themselves in these cultures, but through exhibitions like this, and the ones we do at the Getty regularly, to provide the sort of experience that really can be determinative in people's decisions about how they want to spend not necessarily their lives, but a part of their life and part of the travel and the experience of other cultures that they wouldn't otherwise have. So enough about that and me. In the years after the Civilization exhibition, a number of very important exhibitions coordinated by the British Museum were offered to certain museums around the world. And I was privileged to be able to host the one on the left on Art and Empire, which is on the Assyrian reliefs, at both the National Gallery in Melbourne and at the Kimball in Fort Worth, Texas. And even in more recent days or years, the British Museum has very generously lent us more works from both of the Assyrian culture and of Egypt, as you see on the right. That is the current installation of Egyptian sculptures that we have here at the Getty Villa at the moment. And no institution has been more generous to us over the years for these installations and for our many other exhibitions than has been the British Museum. We're partners in a number of conservation projects, and conservation, of course, is at the core of what we do, as well as acquiring works of art. We have to, of course, preserve them, keep them in as best condition they can, research them, analyze them, and make them accessible to scholars and others around the world. Just a few examples. The works on the left, these plaster sculptures, are some 9,000 years old, among the very earliest figures of the human body that we know of, from Turkey. They were excavated, in fact, sorry, these are not from Turkey. They were excavated in Jordan in 1983, in fact, the same year as the lion box that we were looking at earlier. And we are conserving 5 of these sculptures. The British Museum has been involved in conserving others, along with the University College London, their curator. And they will, of course, go back when they're fully conserved to Amman in Jordan. But it's been a very productive collaboration between the Jordanians, the British Museum, and the Getty. The same thing, basically, as the project on the right, but this is a project, again, British, Italian, Egyptian, and American scholars developing a website and a long-range program of analysis, conservation, and education on this category of mummy portraits of the Roman period in Egypt. You just have to Google Apia with 2 P's and Getty, and you'll get to that website. I'm going to skip over this because this relates to the CSMVS exhibition that Nicholas has already talked about, but there are some of our colleagues working in Mumbai on the installation of this material. And in fact, in the center, you see Dave Saunders, who was one of the curators at the Getty Villa here. And unfortunately, we lost him to the British Museum as their new curator of Greek art, and particularly vase painting. But he was a very active and important part of the project from the Getty end as well. We have a very active program of conservation where we bring works particularly from Italy, but other parts of the Mediterranean and Near East as well, to do conservation work that we have the resources, equipment, and expertise to do, and are able to then, after the completion of the work, send them back to their host countries from which they have come in even better condition than they were originally. Here you see 2. One is the Herculaneum, the portrait, the statue of Tiberius on the left. The brown areas are the 18th century and some of the ancient and 18th century restorations of the sculpture. In the center is the very famous Moccia charioteer from the small island of Moccia off Sicily. There, as well as conserving that extraordinary marble sculpture, we were able to provide it with one of the seismic mitigation bases that could preserve it if there were an earthquake in the region. An object of that brittleness, if you like, weight and brittleness in an earthquake could be very much in danger. But these are the bases that our conservators have developed here at the Getty Museum, which allow the object to stay in place even though the base underneath it moves from side to side in the situation where there is actually an earthquake. And we have in fact written the book on how to to develop this technology and how to deploy it in museums. Another joint conservation project involving a very important Egyptian work from Turin. Again, the British Museum, the Italian scholars, and the Getty scholars all collaborating. The same thing with other Italian vases here from Altamura, the famous underworld scenes from this very important vessel, unique in fact, and some of the conservation analysis which you see in the various scannings that have been done in the process of its restoration. And then the other, I think, major theme that unifies a lot of what we do at the Getty in terms of our scholarship and our exhibitions in particular, and that is putting a spotlight on the connections which were a fact of life particularly in the ancient, through art history in fact, but looking at the classical world in context, in particular, looking at the relationships between the Greco-Roman world and the other great civilizations of the Mediterranean, whether it be Egypt, Persia, Anatolia, and further down the line for us will be the Levant. It's very important to understand that just as Greece and Rome didn't emerge within its own bubble culturally, all of these cultures were interacting during over very long periods, in fact millennia of time. And if to have any sort of deep understanding of art history, you have to understand the give and take between these cultures, whether it's regional or whether it's through time in certain other regions. The understanding of culture, whether it's visual or literary or otherwise, does require an understanding of those interactions. Other of our exhibitions have looked at those connections through time. Some of these exhibitions, which you're seeing on the screen, the one on the top right is Twombly and Antiquity, an artist who had a very active and keen interest in antiquity in his very contemporary work. The Coons at the bottom left, which was part of an exhibition we did on Plato in LA, looking at, if you like, the philosophy of Plato in its latest forms, manifestations, and the juxtaposition of works of photography in our galleries to again compare and contrast and juxtapose contemporary works and contemporary art with those of other periods. Then there are all the sort of challenges we face. And perhaps we can, at this point, I'm very quickly going to turn it over to questions, but we all face challenges regarding sustainability, not just in our lives as museum directors, of course, in the world generally, but within museums we have particular issues with our carbon footprint. We're trying to do fewer, longer exhibitions rather than shorter ones. We're trying to broaden the environmental parameters of temperature and humidity to reduce our carbon footprint, and many other endeavors that we're involved in. And then there are the general issues or trends, if you like, both in the museum world and the art world more generally. The, if you like, blurring of the division between traditional art as we know it as a physical medium versus digital forms of art versus artificial intelligence, and how these are interacting with each other, and with the increasingly open access and democratization of art, which is essentially a good thing, but except until it isn't, when things that you think are genuine are not genuine, and etc. And of course there's the other forms of experience that are increasingly the way people like to experience art, whether it's immersively or in an interactive way through social media and other forms. And then there are the big questions which we've grappled with for decades, if not centuries, about who gets to own the art that they have in their museums, what is the provenance history of them, where did they come from, how did they come to us, and on what basis were those decisions taken, then what should be our approach to resolving those questions now, and also who's telling the story, who gets to write the narrative and why, or who gets to, as it were, rewrite the narrative. So plenty of ideas. There's far too much to talk about, but I'd like now to throw it open to questions, either things we've touched on in this discussion, but also in other things that you would like to ask us. I can see you.
There's a microphone coming.
I'd like to thank you for starting with saying that the ancient painting from 1776, of course, is somewhere around the birthplace of this nation, and then moving to a contemporary piece made in Canterbury. I think one of the things that's interesting is that this piece made in Canterbury, which now lives in France, shows this state-of-the-art technology that the Normans used when they were invading the UK, of course. And I wonder, given that the British companies are going to be coming in here next week, and one of the things they're going to be talking about is AI and these very modern technologies, how do you, both the British Museum and the Getty, how do you think about utilizing AI or other technologies, either to find, to curate, to detect, or to spread the word about these, the art, the masterpieces that you have in your collections? I noticed that you were talking about immersive things and different ways of interacting with them, but AI in particular is interesting in this context for me.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think we're at the very early stages of, we're sort of guessing what the implications will be. I have no doubt that they'll be very wide-ranging. There'll be certain forms of, if you like, not facial recognition, but forms of recognition. There'll be an incredibly useful research tool. Like anything, it depends on the output, depends on the input, what you tell it to look for, how you guide it. But I think the potential revolution in scholarship that and things like being able to read papyrus scrolls that have been carbonized and so on, which can be, as it were, digitally read through the digital unrolling of the scroll. Things like that are going to be, huge breakthroughs.
I mean, I think you've covered it. I'll just add one point. As Tim mentioned, we have a huge collection of cuneiform tablets, which are the earliest forms of writing and knowledge. And we have an extraordinary curator, Irving Finkel, who every time he does a video, it sort of breaks the internet because he's everyone's idea of what a proper curator of the ancient Middle East should look like. And when I started 2 years ago, I went to every department, I met everyone, and Irving, I don't think it would be unkind to say I think he's very close to sort of retirement age, but we're pretty flexible with retirement age at the British Museum. And he talked to me about his work on the cuneiform tablets. And he said, yes, it's going to take another 470 years to finish them all, and I'm going to do the job. So I think I know that he's quite worried about AI because there is this sort of feeling that it could actually be, do work that otherwise a curator or a scholar would have to spend many, many years doing. So I think, as Tim said, it will definitely change things. But I think it's a question of trying to harness these new technologies for good.
Couple there. Yeah.
Thank you. Everything you've said tonight has been about collaboration, about finding connections in antiquity, and I suppose even in the contemporary moment. But there is a political definition of Western civilization that's being articulated, certainly in the US and to some degree in Europe also. So my question for you then is, what role do you think institutions like yours can play in a world which is about borders and about reclaiming this Western civilization, which seems to be under attack by the hordes, so to speak? And as someone who teaches, I mean, this is a question that a lot of my students will also bring to class with. They have an understanding of Western civilization, which is basically Europe, right? I mean, they don't see the connections that our institutions like yours can actually sort of reveal for us. So in such a polarized world, I mean, to what extent are you thinking about, okay, so can I explicitly challenge the prime minister or the president? That's nonsense. Or, I mean, how do you navigate that space in which there's clearly a clash between the art historical understanding of civilizations and a political understanding of civilizations?
Shall I start? And then
do,
it's a good softball question. So no, it's really interesting. I think about this a lot, and I think in a nutshell, what I would say to that is I think all the questions that you rightly pose that we're all grappling with in our daily lives, to me make not that it's just about the British Museum, but to me make everything that the British Museum is or could be even more important or even more relevant or even more urgent or timely. And I, like a lot of people, I'm increasingly worried about, you know, this fracturing where there's more and more nationalism. You know, more and more we're being pitted against each other or told that there's only one particular way to look at something. So I think anything that can kind of get us out of those algorithms of, you know, an echo chamber and actually make us talk to each other, listen to each other, understand something that's different, understand a different perspective. Personally, I mean, I'm not really thinking about Western civilization so much, although obviously that's my background and that's my context. But, you know, the British Museum, it's about civilizations, and, you know, we spend 2 million years of human history, and, you know, a huge amount of that time, whether it's the oldest objects like hand axes from Africa, or we've been talking about, you know, Sumerian culture and cuneiform tablets. These were things that existed long before there was any kind of European civilization. So I'm more interested in civilization, I suppose, than you know, a particular part of the world. But obviously, yeah, we live in a very interesting time, and I think, you know, certainly in working for a British institution, you can never really be political in a strong sense. You know, I can never state publicly my political views, or I have to be neutral. But I think what's almost more important, going back to the biotapestry, you know, France and the UK since Brexit have not always had the best relationship. Culture seems to be able to somehow do something that politicians struggle to be able to do. So I do believe that culture can actually sometimes go beyond what politics is able to help it to do, and help us to kind of create more dialogue. But
yeah, and I just, if I could just to add to that, I think the Western bit is the bit that, of course, we're sort of retreating from, because it is making an assumption that that's sort of primary, and that the 18th century view of Western civilization as rooted in Greece and Rome and for all of that. In fact, what the exhibitions and the scholarship has shown since the 18th century into the 21st century is that a lot of what we thought came from the West was preceded by, you know, superior knowledge and equally creative, you know, art, philosophy, science, and so on, in places like Babylon and in Central Asia, and in, you know, so there was no single direction of civilization from one direction to the other. It was multi-directional at all periods. And I think that's what our program of exhibitions on the classical world and context is exactly trying to make that point, that there's no priority here. It's not that Greece and Rome was the mother lode and the others were satellites. It was these other cultures, both near and far, were equally sophisticated, important, and influential.
I'm going to ask a question that's coming through from people who are online, because I think it's somewhat related and an extension of what you guys are talking about right now. So this is coming from, I believe it's coming from a gentleman by the name of John Bacon. Given that many of your institutions given that many of your institutions' collections and much of your own expertise are rooted in regions currently facing conflict and cultural destruction, are your institutions adapting the co-hosting model or otherwise engaged with the temporary safeguarding or stewardship of cultural materials from affected areas by war or instability, for example, Iran, Lebanon, or Gaza?
Good question. Do you want to go
Yeah,
first?
well, there have been attempts, but I'm not sure they've been as successful as we would want them to be. I mean, and in fact, going back, there was the looting in Afghanistan, and which got tied up in politics, and there was an attempt to remove them from the country during the war there, and it failed for political reasons, and then the looting was horrendous. And there are, what's been happening it's not just with antiquities, what's happening in Ukraine with, of course, the destruction. So there have been efforts, but I'm not, when you're talking about war zone, and often you're talking about war zones where the priority, of course, is saving lives, but the damage to the cultural heritage can be very extreme and very appalling. But it's hard to think of situations where we've actually succeeded in a major way.
Just to add to that, I mean, we, like the Getty, we do a huge amount of this, and it's often necessarily fairly quiet because of security reasons. One example I could talk about right now is Sudan. Obviously, the terrible conflict that's unfolding there. And because of our curators that have very long-standing, in-depth relationships with colleagues in Sudan, we're able to help and support in terms of either museums that have been looted. I think it paints a much more complex picture than is maybe in the public imagination. I'll give you one very simple example. There's understandably a big discussion about human remains and the ethics of showing human remains and about dignity and is this correct. But one thing that makes it a bit more complicated is we've been entrusted with about 2,000 human remains from Sudan over the last 20 years. Those weren't things that were taken or that we extracted. We've been given them for safekeeping because our colleagues there know that we have either the technology and the capacity, but also there's really trusted relationships. And so I think sometimes when you think about museums, it can become quite sort of totemic or corporate, but actually what museums really are is internationally, we're all a network of scholars and peers, and we're always trying to collaborate and to sort of do what we can to help, especially in places of need.
And too often we're playing catch up, and we're coming in after the disaster, like in Palmyra. And the British Museum was very good in Iraq, in Basra, and in Mosul and other places. But it's coming in after the damage has been done and trying to ameliorate. But really, the real solution is preventing the damage in the first place.
I had a question for Dr. Cullinan. I really admire this discussion between the two of you tonight about the international collaboration, but the question really relates to contested items. And as an example, a terribly obvious one, we haven't mentioned tonight the Elgin marbles, and I would like a little bit of a discussion of that, if you wouldn't mind. But on a broader level, the British Museum, the Louvre, any of these encyclopedic museums are full of items that are contested. And some of the things that you discussed this evening, the Ashanti loans, are a marvelous way of addressing those issues, and I think it's really super. More specifically with the Elgin marbles, is there anything new? I mean, I know that has a sort of long, complicated history, as all these things do. Yeah. But is there anything you can say about that now that you're relatively new to the museum?
Sure.
And also, more broadly, how you view either international collaboration or even repatriation of contested items.
Thank you. That was a good question. We actually have the Greek Consul General here, who I was just talking to before we began about this very issue. So, I'm gonna begin with the impediment first, and then talk about, because really what I've been describing is ways potentially around this issue for the future and how to make progress. So the specific impediment for the British Museum and other national museums in the UK is a law that was enacted by Parliament in 1963, which essentially forbids museums that are publicly funded by the British government and the British taxpayer from deaccessioning. And that includes restitution. So basically, currently, along with other UK museums, we're not allowed, even if we want to restitute or to give away or sell anything from the collection. So there's a complete ban on that. That's a huge debate that we could spend a lot more time talking about. I think the reality is that there's no sign in the UK currently that that law is going to change. It's primary law, which is like the highest bar in the UK. It would be literally an act of Parliament to change that law. And I say that not to deflect or shut down the discussion or say, well, don't look at me, ask these other guys. But the reality is, like, currently that means that there's nothing we can do. I don't think that's good enough. And I think that the question is, how can you find 21st century solutions to, 18th century, 19th century, essentially kind of colonial problems? In the case of the Parthenon, this has been pretty much in the public domain for the last couple of years. There's a very active discussion with Greece at the highest level. It would be wonderful to reach a partnership. I think both sides, we have sort of practical and political impediments, but the will is to try to find a way to sort of go beyond those. It would be such a fantastic thing because one of the issues around the Parthenon is it's meant there's been very little kind of collaboration between the British Museum and many colleagues in Greece, because it's been, understandably, it's very sensitive. But everyone loses out, and that would be so fantastic if we could actually work together. And yes, of course, by all means, exchange and circulate objects. But this is never just about objects alone. It's also about the things that animate objects and make them really exist in the world, which is research, scholarship, the reception of these things. It would be such a fantastic thing to achieve that. So the answer is we're not there yet. You would have heard about it probably if we'd had a breakthrough, but we're going to really keep trying because there's the will to try to find a solution. What I would say is, when I started 2 years ago, and I've got that list they're on the website of the British Museum. There's like 20 cases that are the most contested objects, basically. So obviously, the Parthenon sculptures, the Benin bronzes, and there's others. And for some of them, I thought, well, this one, there must be the clear solution. Everything is actually much more complicated than you realize. And that doesn't mean that therefore you do nothing. You keep trying. And I think a lot of it is about entering a really good faith dialogue, and that will kind of carry on. So my hope is, I would love for finally, after 2 centuries, that we are able to have a breakthrough. That's not going to be currently that everything can be restituted, because we're just not able to do that. But I would love to find a way that we can actually begin a process of kind of collaboration and exchange. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah. Well, just to say that as well as the ones that are sort of contested and therefore to be contested, they have to be known about, and there's a discussion and there's a debate and there's different points of view. There's a huge but unquantifiable body of material which gets looted at some point in its past and is circulating in black markets where it's not accessible. You don't even know these things exist until occasionally they pop up somewhere somehow. And that's material which is not being conserved, it's not being published, it's not being looked after. And we can sometimes trace it, as I say, but it's only occasionally. And the challenge is to stop that material going into that dark area of the antiquities market where it just is fundamentally criminal activity. So I think efforts are being made, and I think there's been a noticeable evolution in practice, both certainly within museums and even with some dealers. And so there is progress. I think standards, are much higher of due diligence on works, but it's that huge black market that we can't quantify, but we know it's there, which is, I think, the biggest challenge of all.
quick comment towards the last question, but I love the fact that I can walk into a museum and see a civilization that I can't visit. And I love the fact that you protect these items. So, and I haven't been able to go back to my country of origin for political reasons. So thank you for keeping them safe. That's comment. Yeah. But my question is, with the beginning of this talk, you were talking about relationships. So are museum relationships becoming more liquid to do with extraordinary works of art?
When you say more liquid, you mean, what exactly do you mean?
A lot of the examples you gave is ownership being shared.
Yeah.
And I find that idea actually great because they don't sit in storage and more people get to see these items.
Yeah, so do we. We want to do more of it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just wondering whether there are going to be objects that are going to have a more liquid life by being able to travel more.
I would hope so. I completely agree. I mean, I think if you love culture or you're the custodian or curator of it, that means you want to share it, you want to circulate it, you want as many people to be fascinated by it, to have their lives changed by it. I have no interest in really having things locked away. I mean, obviously some things do need to be in storage, like works on paper that need to rest. And what I would say specifically to your point is, I think there is a new generation or generations of curators that are innately much more collaborative and flexible in their thinking. I'm thinking of, for example, like Elise Christophe, who I mentioned, who is a curator in our Africa, Oceania, and the Americas department, who curated the Hawaii exhibition. And everything she does is seen. She works at the British Museum, and I think she's very happy to. I can't speak for her; she's not here tonight. But it's also thinking about her colleagues and her community in this specific case in Hawaii. So I think certainly the British Museum, which is all I can talk about, I think the thinking is changing, which is less that we're this extraordinary bastion of knowledge and we broadcast out to everyone that visits, into a dialogue where we're also listening and learning, and we're having sometimes quite difficult conversations, as we should, because of our shared difficult history. So I think it's just a shift from being more in sort of broadcast mode to actually engaging in a dialogue. Thank you.
Yep. I also want to follow up on the contested issue. I teach cultural policy here at UCLA, and one of the case studies that I have my students look at are the Benin bronzes, which you mentioned. And the question that I ask my students to explore is, was the German government right to return the Benin bronzes to the Oba of Benin, or should they have been more careful?
Tim, I think that's a question for you.
That's funny. I was thinking it was a question for you. Would you mean between the Oba and the other authority? Yes. It's hard as an outsider, I think, to make an informed decision. I mean, I think it has to be resolved, within Benin and the authority of the Oba and the others and the political center of government. So I would say, we can't, as outsiders, make that decision for them. Somehow, I think they have to resolve it.
So what I would say is, I kind of worry about being too binary in these issues. That there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. It's win or lose. It's here or there. I mean, to go back to the previous point, I think it's wonderful that culture can circulate, can be seen in different contexts. I mean, that's why as we began, I actively advocated for the portrait of Mai not to be at the National Portrait Gallery in London 100% of the time. I think it's wonderful. It has two different contexts because of the artist and the sitter. And so, to go back to your point, so I was in Benin City for the opening of MOA that we have a collaboration with in November. And I saw some of the objects that have been restituted, and I think it's wonderful that they're back home, and I think that's a beautiful, poetic thing. I also think it's wonderful that people can see Benin bronzes and culture from Nigeria internationally, and especially like a diaspora audience. I've had people coming to me to say, that they feel quite torn, because in some ways they love the idea of objects going back to Benin, but if things weren't in London, they would have had no access to their source culture. So I think it's how do we have both, and how can we, in a really good faith way, how can objects and ideas circulate and people rather than a kind of fixed. So I don't think there's a kind of right or wrong answer in any of these things. I think it's about intention and what you do with that. But, yeah.
I'm going to jump in here and ask another question from someone online. Given that you are speaking at the Getty Villa, do you both feel a special obligation as stewards of the past? And how are you thinking about new ways to attract diverse audiences to care about your collections?
Well, stewards of the past, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, the more important than ownership is that these important objects be conserved, be documented, be published, be made accessible to as broad a public as possible. So yes, the stewardship, that is our core, that in a nutshell is the core mission of the institution.
Yeah, I would say the same, which is that, I don't think very much of ownership, but I think I kind of alluded to it before, but if you love something, as a scholar, or, for me, even if you read a book that you love or a piece of music, my first impulse is always to share it with other people, probably sometimes annoyingly so or against their wishes. And so I think, my life was changed by museums. I'm incredibly grateful for that, and I therefore want to open that possibility up to as many people as possible. And of course, if you look after an historic collection, you're a temporary custodian. You want to pass it on to future generations. You want as many different types of people to have access to that. I mean, it's kind of second nature, basically. And that work is never done. You have to always kind of keep on building on that.
I think I'm next. Thank you both so much for this wonderful lecture. Congratulations to the British Museum on the acquisition of the Catherine of Aragon pendant, saving it for the nation or some such. I was wondering if, considering the nature of that pendant, it was apparently immediately obvious that it was something that would be good to bring the public in for that fundraising, bring in Damian Lewis and all of that, as well as for both of you. Are there ways, other than fundraising, to bring the public into that process of acquisition? Because I think so many people are so curious about how museums build their collections. Thank you.
So thank you. This is, we acquired something in February of this year. I lose track. It's been a busy year already. Called the Tudor Heart, which is this amazing item that was found in a field outside Birmingham in the Midlands in 2019. And one of the things that we do at the museum is we oversee the treasure program, which I just love, the fact that we have a treasure program. And it's basically where, in the UK, amateur detectorists, so metal detectorists, if they find something that's deemed to be treasure because of its value or its age, and therefore historic importance, it needs to be declared, and then it goes through a process of should it be in a museum. And the Tudor Heart was something that was found in a muddy field in December of 2019, and it turns out it was from a tournament that marked the marriage of Henry VIII with Catherine of Aragon. And there's very little that survives from that time, and especially to do with Catherine of Aragon. So we acquired it. And as you say, we launched a public appeal, and it's not something we've done at the British Museum for quite some time. We haven't really done big acquisitions of public appeals. We got Damian Lewis, of course, who plays Henry VIII, to be an advocate for it. And the amazing thing is 45,000 members of the public donated to it. It's incredible. I mean, I think that might be unprecedented, that so many people felt so strongly that this should be in a museum and their children should have access to it, that they actually they donated it. It's really remarkable. It's not about how much people gave, it's how many people gave. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Sorry, yes, okay, yeah.
Can you be the Prime Minister?
I might be. I think the way it's going, we all get a turn, but yeah, at some point.
Thank you both for your really remarkable insights tonight. My question follows on from previous conversations, and I'd really like to know your perspectives on where does change need to begin in order to create museums that are more ethical in practice, that are more representative and more accessible. In conversations that I've had with colleagues and friends in both museum and academic contexts, some people believe very strongly that change must begin at the level of the government. And as you have pointed out, with the restrictions surrounding restitution policy in Britain, that seems like a pretty difficult case. But where do you think personally that this change can originate within museums themselves?
Do you want to go first, Noel?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can always be better in lots of ways, I'm sure about that. I do think we approach the key sort of processes of acquiring the stewardship, the conservation and so on, the protection of objects, with a framework of ethical and best practice sort of science towards preserving these objects into the future for future generations. And to me, that's the critical thing, that they survive and be accessible. They'll be reinterpreted, re-understood in all sorts of different ways we can't imagine. But the most important thing we can do is preserve their, existence and their well-being in that process. I suppose what I'm missing is, where is it that we are? Can you put your finger on where is it that we're being unethical or we're doing something that feels wrong?
Myself? No, not necessarily. I just think that there's always a process of amelioration and, considering how best to go forward when, as we have been identifying, nationalism and the rhetoric, in our highest levels can seem so at odds with the goals that we are attempting to put forward.
Yeah, no, that opens up, very broad, sort of very broad issues, which is probably would be another 3-hour conversation. I realize we're already, I'm being told, over our allotted time. So perhaps we could have 2 questions? John's telling me 1. Okay, we're going to flip. Who's got their hand up?
So my question actually ties into with this, and you already have touched up on how museums are actively reevaluating questions of representation, accessibility, and decolonialization. But how does each of your institutions approach diversity? Not only in audiences, acquisition, conservation priorities, and programming, but also in leadership and long-term partnerships throughout society. I'm a conservation professional, and diversity within our profession has been a main concern for now many years, and we're actively working on this, but it would be wonderful to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's few dimensions to that question. In terms of diversity of audiences, we very actively try to engage with particular communities who might have an interest, whether it's through their background, language, or whatever, and make them feel as welcome as possible in the context of our exhibitions, our public programs, our events that we do here. I think then the other side of the coin, if you're talking about the diversity of the actual conservators as a category of expertise, I think we share that problem, the diversity problem, not just in conservators, we do have it there, but in curators, in across our institutions, pretty well in all departments. We're doing our best to, and all of our hiring practices involve those considerations. Are we there yet? I would say no, for sure, but it's just an ongoing priority that we are trying to do our best in. Okay, well, I think that was the last question. Do you want to have any final thoughts?
No, I think that wraps it up. Well, I suppose there's just one thing that I was thinking about, because I did want to kind of speak to both, but we're out of time. One of my favorite quotes is by Giuseppe Tommaso de Lampedusa from his novel The Leopard, which is about these Sicilian aristocratic families in the 19th century, and everything is crumbling around them, and they realize that change is coming. And there's a great moment where one of the characters says, if we want things to stay as they are, then things will have to change. And I think that's the reality that we're all dealing with, that institutions, constantly have to change. Always comes because new people come and work there, they bring new perspectives, they have new demands and new questions. And so I think if you think about something in a very totemic way, museums can seem maybe very slow moving, but the reality is, because they're powered by people, they're always changing. So that's what I would, to answer both points, and that's the trick, is that you keep things growing and moving whilst preserving the past.
Well, on that semi-philosophical note, I want to thank you for being here, but particularly Nick Cullinan for joining us today. Thank you.